to all of you, but I'd gone to Alwar for election campaigning and got a little late coming into the city. And some of my getting late is also because of the huge traffic along the way, which is very much reflective of the energy and the buzz that we have all over the city and the country today, with relentless growth in almost every sector, leading to huge demand for energy. Energy, whether it's to power the automobiles or energy to power our venues, our hotels, our homes, our businesses. The demand is just growing relentlessly. And in the car, I was just seeing the petroleum import numbers. That's another figure which is just going off the roof. What I'm trying to say is that India is currently in a phase where for the next 30 years, we're going to see huge amount of growth in the economy. And obviously that's going to lead to significant demand for energy in all our walks of life. So our transition has two dimensions. A, what do we do to transit from the past consumption levels? And what do we do to meet the needs of this growth? And both collectively make this a very big challenge. In the circumstances that we are in, we've been upping our targets, increasing our targets on almost every aspect of the energy transition story, be it getting clean energy into the system, our efforts to replace the demand for crude oil with maybe electric vehicles, then the simultaneous effort to make sure that the clean energy-based vehicles are introduced in the market so we don't have coal producing electricity only to power an electric vehicle. So our transition has a very large end-to-end dimension on which we are working so that we start our entire energy need with a clean source. We use the circular economy principles in terms of recycling, reuse, and ensure that we also focus a little bit on energy efficiency. We have a gentleman in the room who's powering the LED revolution in the country. So I think broadly, India is working on many fronts. We are also supporting the production of energy, clean energy equipment in India, hoping to transition to green hydrogen and then green ammonia so that at scale, clean energy can become the source for our growth. It's a combination of different factors which collectively will help us transition out from the past into a glorious future where the kind of difficulties that we are seeing all over the world, we don't have to go through those difficulties for far too long. We are facing a stress right now, but our effort is that matching with our growth, we are able to transition both for the future and to take care of the past.
Minister, I'll just pick up from one of the points you made about pushing manufacturing of green relevant equipment. Now, one of the key initiatives of this government has been the production-linked incentive program, which has worked very well with mobile phones and now consumer electronics and appliances. How is this scheme relevant to green sectors and green industries?
I think it's most relevant. It's one of the finest, well-thought, well-crafted areas of government policy to promote manufacturing in India. And it's not only mobile phones, it's cutting across several sectors, auto components, specialty steels, textiles, technical textiles. So we've been able to identify specific areas in which production-linked incentive schemes are under operation in a few areas, but largely still under implementation in most areas, where schemes were introduced only post-COVID. I think in green energy, we have some investments coming in for solar, highly efficient solar PV manufacturing, PV module manufacturing. Green hydrogen also has received some government support. But I think these are the areas and areas in energy efficiency. We have, for example, LED bulbs. We have gone in for all the components of LED bulbs receiving support under the PLI scheme so that our import dependence on LED bulbs reduces significantly. So like that, every aspect of energy, we should be able to support wherever required. Now we have certain aspects where the support is possibly indirect. Ethanol, for example, the support is only in terms of our buying the ethanol that is produced in the country and allowing its blending in petrol products. Other than that, we don't need to give a cash support. We do give some interest subsidy for those who are setting up ethanol plants. Broadly, what we are looking at is seeing where the support is really required and where the program can be self-sufficient. Ideally, I am one of those who believes that subsidies can only be like a kickstart. When a motorcycle is being started or a scooter is being started, you give that extra kick and get the machine going. After that, it runs on its own using minimal energy or energy source. I think the PLI schemes broadly function on that principle. The effort is only to give it that momentum in the initial period. But ultimately, Michael Porter's theory will work, that every country will have its own competitive advantages or comparative advantages amongst nations. And wherever we'll be competitive, wherever we'll have ability to produce high quality goods at efficient and competitive prices, we'll make a mark.
Minister, you spoke about comparative advantage. Right now, obviously a key imperative in trade. You are, in a sense, India's FTA minister. That's your responsibility as commerce minister. How key are green energy imperatives while negotiating FTAs?
I think the world is still to come to terms with the responsibilities that different nations have when it comes to this clean energy transition. We had all agreed in Paris at COP21 that different nations will have different levels of responsibility. And based on the responsibility matrix, we'll also have to work out the financing and the availability of technologies. We have yet to see the world come up to the expectations, the developed world, come up to the expectations of, or the needs of funding, particularly low cost, long tenor funding that would be required for meeting the transition financing needs. At the bare minimum, and I think this figure really has no great significance in terms of its ability to assure total transition, but at the very bare minimum, it was expected that $100 billion would be made available by the developed world, the polluters in the first place. After all, India is not the person who's responsible for this mess up there. Despite supporting 17% of global population, our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions or the depletion of the ozone layer is barely 2.5%. So we are not the polluters in the first place. And keeping in mind the polluter pays principle, it was expected that these countries would go that extra mile by providing very low cost or zero cost, long tenor funding, grant-based funding to encourage the less developed countries and developing world to transition. Sadly, they've let down the whole world. And neither do I see the ability nor the enthusiasm in the developed world to really meet that obligation. Secondly, energy transition also has a lot of technology needs. I'll share two specific examples to give clarity to the needs, how important technology can be when we are looking at transition. If we see the air conditioning, the traditional air conditioning leaves behind a huge impact on the ozone layer. Newer ways of cooling, newer technologies have been developed, but that technology is held by a cozy club of 2 or 3 companies who charge an arm and a leg for it, because of which it's so unaffordable that consumers in, let's say, a country like India cannot be forced to pay that higher value because of the sins of people in another country who have enjoyed all the benefits of low cost and have messed up the environment during their development cycle. So a country in Europe, which is today a $50,000-$60,000 or $100,000 per capita economy, has achieved that on the back of low cost of energy. Very easy to preach to the rest of us today that we should be doing something to keep environmental concerns before us when we take policy or when we ask our consumers to spend more. But the reality is the consumer is going to say, I never caused this problem in the first place. Why should I pay for the sins of somebody else? And therefore, technology will have to be made available so that that extra cost on air conditioning will not be borne by our consumers, and the huge profit that certain technology developers make has to be socialized to allow this energy transition to happen. The second and more important element is the transition from coal. India is one of those countries which has massively injected intermittent power, whether it's wind or solar. These are intermittent sources of power. They are not available on a steady state basis through the day. Particularly in the peak hours, you could be totally stressed out if one was to look at even greater degree of renewable energy. So the base load, which today in India is coal, needs to be replaced by an alternate base load. I remember so many conversations with very senior leaders where I'm telling them, give us an alternative, we are happy to change. But nobody in the world has any viable alternative to offer. Some people do talk about nuclear, but I don't think there is enough capability or capacity to even manufacture nuclear plants needed for the growth in our power requirement. Forget what we are already consuming. Our annual 8-10% growth in power also cannot be met by all the nuclear plants that are made all over the world. So I think the world will have to recognize this very serious challenge of an alternate base load to coal before they preach to us that we have to look at transiting from the old traditional sources of.
Just to take the logic of what you spoke about forward, as trade minister, as commerce minister, when you encounter foreign partners talking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism or such instruments, it must concern you because these somehow violate equity.
Well, certainly any such taxes sought to be imposed are a matter of concern because there's a lot of uncertainty around these developments. Right now, of course, there's a reporting requirement that has kicked in last month. The tax, the carbon border adjustment mechanism tax, CBAM, will start sometime in 2026. But personally, I think we in India need not be concerned about it beyond the stage. Of course, we are in dialogue with the European Union and the European countries and their leadership to understand more about it and to see how this will play out. But there are two aspects which I would like all of you to know, and therefore you can rest assured that you are in safe hands. The government is seized of the issue fully and is in dialogue, and solutions will be found. One, if the country from which the goods originate taxes carbon at the level at which the European Union taxes their domestic companies, then there will be no additional tax on our exports to those countries. So if we collect the tax in India itself and use it for our green energy transition, which indirectly will help the same companies who are exporters as they transition to cleaner energy and bring down their carbon footprint, there will be no additional CBAM tax at the European border. And we'll find a solution around a domestic tax which will take care of equating European and Indian taxes. Of course, we are talking to them that the unfair part is how can carbon be priced the same in India as it is priced in Europe. So we are still in negotiation on that aspect. But as long as we keep the taxes at home, utilize it for our own green energy transition, I think we won't have an uncompetitive edge in our exports to Europe. Their own concern is they're trying to make their own industries survive. Because if they tax carbon in Europe and we do not, their own domestic industry will collapse. And I think it's only fair that every country has to at least provide their own country, companies or manufacturers, a level playing field. So I don't grudge them that. They could jolly well as impose it like a GST or a VAT, a domestic VAT. Then they would be entitled to have a countervailing duty on their borders for anything we exported. In fact, that would have been worse for us. This is better that we have an opportunity to keep it here. But I'll give you the other dimension, which I keep repeating to all the friends from Europe, including my meeting with the commissioner last week, where I said that this step is going to cause the death knell of manufacturing in Europe. Now just imagine, steel or aluminium is only a base product. On the top of that will be all the value-added products that are manufactured there. First casualty I can visualize is the auto sector. The auto sector of Europe will be over, which will be a great opportunity for countries like India to develop a very vibrant auto sector. Because every input that gets costlier in Europe, particularly for a market which is a big exporter of their goods and services, everything that gets costlier in Europe provides us a competitive edge in the rest of the world for our automobiles to be smarter, better, produce at scale, get economies of scale, get the best of technologies, and those same companies will come and start manufacturing in India. So they're actually shooting themselves in the foot, is what my personal assessment is, and I've been sharing it with the Europeans. I'm not so much worried. I think one of these days they'll themselves realize and we'll have to drop this CBAM. It's ill-conceived and has not addressed the entire issue correctly and fairly. They will have to give different values to the less developed and developing countries and try and bring a level playing field in smarter ways than trying to hurt us or our exports.
Thank you. That's very good to know, Minister. I now move to the G20. India has just concluded a very successful G20 summit, where green issues, energy transition, technology, finance, adaptation, were all very, very important subjects of discussion. Separately, the Global South was brought into the conversation at G20 in a big way. To what degree do you think countries of the Global South, led by India, can actually put together a green energy value chain?
Well, one of the important announcements on the sidelines of G20 was the corridor which we have launched, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. I think if you look into it, you'll realize that this is the type of joint initiatives which will have a huge impact in our energy transition goals also. I don't know how many of you recall, it was when Prime Minister Modi was the Chief Minister of Gujarat that he had articulated his thoughts on one earth, one sun, one earth, one grid. Now, maybe 15 years back when he first spoke about it, it was around 2008 if I remember correctly. Maybe somebody can Google and take out that date. It was around 2008 that Prime Minister Modi said, one sun, one earth, one grid. And there are studies that say that the sun gives us enough power that it can meet the energy needs of the entire world. Where our problem is that sun shines at different parts of the globe at different times. But if you imagine an interconnected grid all over the world, you will have each country receiving power during its peak hours from another country which doesn't need it at that point of time, and we sending our power, surplus power in the afternoon hours when we may not need that to another country which is experiencing peak loads or peak demand. Now, that is one of the outcomes of this IMEC. And frankly, this is expected to go all the way across to Singapore and then to Australia. So what Prime Minister Modi, being a visionary, had articulated 15 years ago, today the world is waking up to recognize that as a very powerful program which can hugely impact our energy transition mission. And we saw the impact of that. I don't know if very often people forget, but I'm sure Mr. Verma or Mr. Sinha sitting here who were in government actively at that point of time will remember when this government came into being at the center in May of 2014. Just look back at the amount of stress the power sector was going through. Almost large parts of India would plunge into darkness. I myself became power minister on 26th May 14, and by 29th May, I think, there was a huge grid collapse in northern India, and the entire Delhi and its surrounding states were without power for days. I remember spending full nights at the banks of the Yamuna and all, looking at all the transmission towers coming up again, and Mr. Sinha was the power secretary with me at that point of time. Your good friend Vinay Chatterjee had written an op-ed on my starting my work, Baptism by Outage. That was the situation. And most parts of the country, our young children here will fortunately not remember or not know about those days. But we have all gone through the days where the issue was not when power will go, because that was a given. It was how soon can we hope that power will come back. Those days are history. And one of the finest work that Mr. Sinha and his team in the power ministry did, and I think you were in UP at that time with the power sector. One of the best things they did was create a national grid all across India, interconnected the entire grid as one. So we are one of those few countries in the world today who has one interconnected grid. And South India, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, there were many months of the year they would pay as high as 12 to 15 rupees per kilowatt hour. That's about 20 cents for those who are from outside the country, per kilowatt hour. And at that point of time, it was probably 25, 30 cents. Whereas in the north, we had power surplus, and it was a completely distorted picture. Many plants had come up in areas without transmission or evacuation facility. When we wanted to inject solar power, and you know, Prime Minister Modi upped the solar mission, national solar mission, from 20 gigawatt to 100 gigawatt, thanks to which today the International Solar Alliance, which is also meeting in Delhi, the General Assembly, is today now becoming a preeminent body looking at the world's transition into cleaner energy. At that point of time, when we did studies, we realized that unless we can integrate the whole grid, we'll never be able to inject 100 gigawatt of solar power into the system. The system would have collapsed with the intermittent power coming in the afternoon in big measure. It's because we have a large interconnected grid that we are able to absorb in a way, the energy shocks or the periods of intermittency. Now, if we have a globally connected grid, Ashok, I had made some predictions on this stage maybe in 16 or 17, which were off the top of my head, but I think will come true going forward. But today, let me tell you something, not that I've studied it, the senior bureaucrats and technical people in this room may actually laugh at me, but I won't be surprised if we find a day in the not too distant future where when you go to buy a loaf of bread, or when you go and buy a packet of chips, you will probably get a voucher for a unit or two of electricity free of charge.
On that happy note, Minister, one final question from you. You have a background in the capital markets. You are a finance person before you became a politician. Do you think the financial markets are responsive enough to India's green energy transitions and its financial and resource needs? And how can they be made?
Unfortunately not. It's quite a ridiculous situation where the developed countries are preaching to us that we are providing you finance and we're going to help you raise finance. We're going to have innovative financing models to help green energy. The reality is, and I say this with full responsibility, that the developed world has totally let down the needs of finance of the less developed countries or developing countries to transition to clean energy. The developed countries have only given lip sympathy. The models that they've created are largely around private capital. And I remember, again, Mr. Sinha will remember, as for our green energy needs, since I was also handling MNRE, you will also remember that we had gone to raise bonds in the international market. And I tell you, we did not even get 10 basis points, not even 10 basis points lower cost on our finance needs in any market in the world. Not a single market. Even the so-called proponents of environment and environment action and the countries which are right in the forefront of environment action did not give us even 10 basis points concession in the cost of finance. You got the rate which your credit rating determined. You were given a bond, or your bonds were subscribed, you were given loans. If your credit rating confirmed that you are a good borrower, which is okay, I have no problem on that. But the concessional finance aspect is totally missing. It's like telling us, you need to transition, but we can't do anything about it. Go to the private sector. I'll give a call to Citibank or Merrill Lynch or Goldman Sachs to help you raise money in the banking system at market-driven prices, at tenors that the market will determine, at interest rates and costs and repayment cycles that the private banking system will determine. It's completely an unfair situation, not at all acceptable, and that is why I say that the developed world has a lot to answer to the world's problems and are entirely responsible for the current state of affairs in the world today.
Absolutely, that's a very sobering note at which to end this conversation. Just before we let you go, Minister, I'd like to invite Priya Shah and Mannat Jaiswal, who are co-editors of a book on energy transition, and I'd also like to invite Vice President of GAP, Saurav Kumar, onto the stage to present the book to the Minister. Priya, Mannat.
Of the LED revolution in India, by the way.